quite a high goal to set. Previously, the goal had been around 70,000. So and as you might recall, this was during the time, we're still in this time, but where Syrian refugees were obviously really on the front page of the news. There was a lot of
And we are coming to you from Midlothian, Virginia. This is WRWK 93.9 FM. And you're tuning in on a Wednesday night. And we want to say a beautiful Yom Kippur to our listeners and viewers who are celebrating. And we want to thank you for supporting independent radio and joining us for another episode of our show, HER, Human Equal Rights with a Focus on HER, where we talk about women's issues and situations where there is typically inequality for women in a situation of domestic situation, or it could be political, it could be non-political. And as we're seeing play out in the headlines right now in our nation, there is a situation that is very unequal of the way that one side is talked about and the way the other side is talked about. That is not our topic tonight on HER. I'm Sarah Louise, producer of the show, off camera. If you're watching the Facebook Live, I'll give you a wave. Hello. And I'm here with our host, the wonderful Leslie Rubio, and she is going to tell you about our topic tonight. And I'm trying to get all the technical background details going. And we thank you for tuning in. And Leslie, tell us what our topic is and about our special host that we're going to have calling in a little bit.
Sure. Thank you so much for tuning in to WRWK FM 93.9 and to our show, HER, Human Equal Rights with a Focus on HER. Our guest tonight is going to be Patrice Lenowitz. She is joining us to talk about ACE, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. Have you ever heard of it? Maybe you know of adverse childhood experiences, but you never knew there was a name for that. And I'm sure probably many of you listening may have experiences of your own that relate directly to our that there was a name, and that specific studies have been done and follow-up studies continue to better understand the effects that trauma has on children. And this is acute trauma through lived experiences. Before I continue on with that, I just want to first of all say the views expressed during this broadcast are not necessarily the views held by WRWK 93.9, the Work FM, its volunteers, or affiliates, but maybe my personal views. I just want to throw this out there, and hopefully we can talk to this about this another time. I know we've all been listening to the confirmation hearings of Mr. Kavanaugh, and I'm sure we all have our own thoughts about that judicial appointment. I feel very strongly that Mr. Kavanaugh should not be confirmed. When I was 16, a high school teacher attempted to rape me, and I will live with that memory for the rest of my life. I have documented my story at 1in5that'smystory.org. If you'd like to go to the website, check it out, even share your own story. I believe both Mark Warner and Tim Kaine, our senators in Virginia, have both said that they will oppose the nomination, but there are other senators who have either not taken a stance or are poised to vote yes. Two female senators, Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, are both undecided. If you have ever been a victim of harassment or a survivor of sexual assault, this might be something you want to mention in your comments to the two senators. If you would like to give each a call, here are their numbers. Lisa Murkowski, 202-224-6665. Susan Collins, 202-224-2523. And we'll move on from that. Just wanted to throw that out there. Thanks again for tuning in. We'd love to partner with your business or group. We offer sponsorship packages with pledges as little as $5 per month. Please consider donating to WRWK to keep us up and running. We need your help. Our call-in number behind me is 804-464-1089. Through this show, my hope is to reach out to community and individuals to openly discuss topics that focus on human equal rights, but more specifically, how this relates to women. So let's get into our topic tonight, which is adverse childhood experiences, or ACE. Childhood experiences, both positive and negative, have a tremendous impact on future violence victimization and perpetration and lifelong health and opportunity. As such, early experiences are an important public health issue. Adverse childhood experiences can have a lasting effect on your health, which ranges from obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide attempts, STDs, heart disease, cancer, stroke, broken bones, and behaviors, smoking, alcoholism, drug use, as well as life outcomes, graduation rates, academic achievements, and lost time from work. In 1998, Dr. William H. Foege, F-O-E-G-E, established the role of early childhood stress on adverse health outcomes and how difficult they were. Psychological, physical, and sexual abuse in childhood are abhorrent, even if there were no adverse health effects in the long term. But now we have indications of prolonged, even lifelong health problems associated with such early trauma. In one of the most significant studies, C. Henry Kemp surprised the medical world with descriptions of the battered child syndrome. They began a process of describing some indicators of childhood abuse and a resulting battered adult syndrome. The study is disquieting in its description of the frequency of abuse against children and how often families appear to be dysfunctional. It's not what we want to believe about our culture, our neighbors, or ourselves. And yet, as troubling as the data seems to be, we need to confront the problems described and find an appropriate public health response. We also need to be honest about how little we know about it. There is no weighing in this study of the relative impact of different types of adverse events, and yet there must be significant differences. There is little information on the relationship of frequency of early trauma and the strength of the association. We lack a clear understanding of the impact of age at the time of first abuse. What factors neutralize the adverse effects later in life? How do adults attempt to self-treat the pain of a troubled childhood? From Pediatrics in March of 2003, they wrote about, in the American Association of Pediatrics, childhood abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, and the risk of illicit drug use, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Improved understanding of the influence of stressful, traumatic childhood experiences on initiation and development of drug abuse is needed. Need to examine the relationship between drug use and categories of adverse childhood experiences. In California, they completed a survey about childhood abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, illicit drug use, and other health-related issues. The main outcomes measured were self-reported use of illicit drugs, including initiation during 3 age categories: 14 years old, 15, and 18 years. Or as an adult, 19 years, lifetime use for each of 4 cohorts dating back to 1900, drug use problems, drug addiction, and parental drug use. As a result of these studies, they developed an ACE score. And they were able to determine by developing this score how each person's risk factors for ACE comes into understanding the drug use problems and lifetime relationship of drug abuse. An ACE score is a tally of different types of abuse, neglect, and other hallmarks of a rough childhood. According to the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the rougher your childhood, the higher your score is likely to be, and the higher your risk for later health problems. I'm going to give you just a few of the questions as part of that study that were used to make a determination for your ACE score. And basically, you were asked to put down a number 1 if you answer yes to any of the following questions. And these all have to do with while you were growing up, during your first 18 years of life. So I'm going to go over them real quick. Did a parent or other adult in your household often swear at you, insult you, put you down, humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? If you answer yes, please enter a 1. Did a parent or other adults in the household often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Number 3, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you or have you touch their body in a sexual way or try to or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal sex with you? Number 4, did you often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Again, put a 1 if you answer yes to this question. Number 5, did you often feel that you didn't have enough to eat? You had to wear dirty clothes and had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? Number 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced? Number 7, was your mother or stepmother often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or sometimes or often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or knife? Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or used street drugs? Was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Did a household member go to prison? So if you answered yes to any of these questions, you would want to put down a number 1. This would give you your ACE score. And in order for you to look up the results of that, you can go to the CDC's website, which would be www.cdc.gov/violence prevention/ACE study. When you go there, you will find, among other things, a list of studies that explore the ways adverse childhood experiences have been linked to a variety of adult conditions ranging from increased headaches to depression to heart disease. Please remember that the ACE score isn't a crystal ball. It's just meant as a guidance. It tells you about one type of risk factor among many. It doesn't directly take into account your diet or genes, whether you smoke or drink excessively, to name just a few of the other major influences on health. Remember, too, that ACE scores don't tally the positive experiences in early life that can help build resilience and protect a child from the effects of trauma. Having a grandparent who loves you, a teacher who understands and believes in you, or a trusted friend you can confide in may mitigate the long-term effects of early trauma or adverse childhood experiences. Safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments can have a positive effect on a broad range of health problems and on the development of skills that will help children reach their full potential. Strategies that address the needs of families and children include home visiting to pregnant women and families with newborns, parenting training programs, intimate partner violence prevention, social support for parents, parent support programs for teens and teen pregnancy, prevention programs, mental illness and substance abuse treatment, high-quality childcare, and sufficient income support for lower-income families. There is a growing number of organizations in Greater Richmond working to educate the community about the impact of trauma on children and families, and this effort involves service providers, educators, government agencies, and community groups. Greater Richmond, Virginia Trauma Informed Community Network is a resource. You can also go to www.acesconnection.com where there are webinars, blogs, and resources for adverse childhood experiences. You can also go to the richmondgov.com site, social services, health and families. There you will learn about the programs that are offered, which have intensive home visiting programs for families with prenatal children who reside in the East District and the South Side of Richmond. Home visitors work with enrolled families until the target child is 3 years of age. The program is designed for parents facing challenges such as single parenthood, low income, childhood history of abuse, and other adverse childhood experiences, and current or previous issues related to substance abuse, mental health issues, and or domestic violence. The Healthy Families Program is also committed to establishing relationships with community partners who serve prenatal and postnatal families to improve and enhance client services. There are several designated referral sites throughout the city of Richmond, which include hospitals, medical offices, local schools, and family resource centers. Services provided include, but are not limited to, screenings and assessments to determine if families are at risk for child maltreatment or other adverse childhood experiences, home visiting services, parent support groups, routine screening for child development and maternal depression, and community-based referrals. You can also make referrals yourself if you feel that you know of someone who is going through this. In order to do that, you can contact Richmond Gov by going to their website or by calling 804-646-3022. Child Savers is a part of the Greater Richmond Trauma Informed Community Network. It's grown to 80 member agencies, including schools, service providers, police and public defenders, nonprofits, and youth advocates. I'll share some more information about what's offered in Richmond, Virginia as well. But right now I would like to extend a welcome to our guest tonight. And that is I'll share some more information about what's offered in Richmond, our guest, Patrice Lenowitz, who is the executive director and founder at the Nurtured Parents. She's going to share what she does with her work around this subject matter. We're going to ask her some questions and hopefully understand better and more about adverse childhood experiences. Patrice is a community educator at the Center for Hope and Safety. She's a domestic violence survivor, victim rights advocate, activist, writer, playwright, producer, and public speaker. Welcome to WRWK, Patrice, and thank you for being our guest tonight on Human Equal Rights.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Leslie.
Thanks for being here. We appreciate it.
So happy to be here and talking about something so important.
So my first question to you is, how did you become involved in the work that you're doing?
This is probably one of those things where I didn't choose it, it chose me. I'm a domestic violence survivor, and pretty much how you discuss the ACE study and the test. I also am a child survivor of extreme violence and things that are on that test. So it wasn't just my adult experience, it was also a childhood experience to trauma. And later on, when I had children and I was leaving an abusive relationship, I think I went through one of the most difficult times of my life when I recognized that family court was failing to protect me and my children. I had no rights to protect my children, and it was probably one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. After that, fortunately, in my area, there's a wonderful organization called Alternatives to Domestic Violence, and I started to attend classes there. And I didn't do it when I was married. I had to do it after I got out of my marriage because of the trauma and re-victimization and PTSD that we were experiencing trying to get divorced and protect my children from my abuser. So I was participating in these classes, and I learned so much. They taught us on how to deconstruct ourselves as victims, the women that we became, and to then reconstruct us into this healthy, empowered version of ourselves, the women that we were meant to be. So that experience led me to, I'm not alone in this. I'm in a support group now, and that support group has 12 women in that support group. 10 of them had the exact same story as me. We were all experiencing extreme abuse by the system, and we were victims as well as our children, and we weren't receiving any respect, we weren't receiving any justice. So that began my walk into this area of victims' rights, because I recognized I wasn't alone. And that moment, Leslie, was actually a wonderful period, because knowing that you're not alone, when you're going through something and you recognize that you're not alone, it was incredibly validating that I wasn't crazy, that this was wrong, and somebody had to do something about it. So around that period, I started becoming knowledgeable. I started reaching out to experts, started doing research on my own, and started recognizing that there's a much bigger problem here, and it has a lot to do with where we are in our country with equal rights, but also that there's this silent killer, adverse childhood experiences. This research was so powerful that as I became a public speaker on domestic violence and human trafficking, I started including this research in every one of my presentations to let people have a greater understanding of what trauma is, how it impacts us, not in the moment, when we're young or even as adults, but the prolonged health consequences to that toxic stress and what it does to our body. And I was fascinated and dove into it and ate up everything I could as far as research, and became a public speaker in this area.
Wow, that's quite a lot. So I never knew there was a name for adverse childhood experiences. I guess probably most of us didn't realize that, even though we may have had experiences or been victims of violence or been around violence, domestic violence. I guess, too, most people who maybe are children, of course, children don't realize that that's just what's happening in their household. And then, of course, what you mentioned is we don't realize how it impacts us later in our adult life.
When I was 23 years old, my kidney shut down.
Wow.
The doctors had no idea why They couldn't give me a medical explanation for why an otherwise healthy, strong 23-year-old woman would have a kidney shut down. And after I came across this research and I started reading about it, that's from toxic stress. I grew up in a home where I don't know if I ever got a full night's sleep because I was always worried about somebody being harmed by my abusive stepfather in the middle of the night. So that when you live in that prolonged state of that fight or flight response to something that's scary, that adrenaline is let through your entire body, and it has to go somewhere. So a typical situation is, you come across a dog that barks at you and it scares you. Your adrenaline gets triggered, and that's your fight or flight mechanism, which keeps us safe. But when we're talking about homes that are riddled with any type of violence, or it could be a parent that is a drug addict or an alcoholic, it could be a domestic violence or sexual abuse home, it could be a child that's been separated from their primary caregiving parent. That's incredibly traumatic, and that toxic stress, that adrenaline doesn't get shut off. It's constantly on, and that mechanism of having that fight or flight, it's for a moment in time so we can make a decision. But when you're living with that constant stress, your body is constantly living as if it's fight or flight every second of the day. And that is what harms our bodies. I don't know if you're aware of this, Leslie, but the Adverse Childhood Experience Study was not conducted for childhood trauma. It was originally a study that was conducted with regards to obesity. Okay. And there were two doctors from Kaiser Permanente and CDC that took on this research on obesity, and it was very extensive, and they had 17,000 participants. And what they discovered was that the weight loss programs that they had put in place for their clients were very successful. But when they did their follow-ups, almost a vast majority of them put all the weight back on and then some. And it was actually an interview question with one of their patients that started this snowball into adverse childhood experiences. The question of her childhood, and it was actually, if I recall correctly, it wasn't even meant to be that type of question, but it was asked in a way that she took it up and said, I was sexually abused as a child.
Wow.
With that response, that began the process of, oh my goodness, we now have this mountain of information, and we're going to go back and we're going to interview all these participants and find out what the connection is. And when they went back and they started asking more and more follow-up questions, they started to discover all of these patients had a score of 1 or higher in their ACE test, which was compiled by them later. But 4 or more, a number of 4 or more on your ACE score was when you had significant and prolonged health consequences to your body, and choices that you would make as far as drug or alcohol use, risky sexual behaviors, self-harming. So this was very powerful. They didn't expect it. But as you mentioned in the beginning of the show, it's one of the largest medical investigations ever conducted to understand what childhood trauma does to the body. And we know for sure now that it changes a child's biology. It completely changes our biology, and it'll last for a lifetime. So it could be a stress response to growth rates, to diabetes, to asthma, heart disease. There are so many things that are triggered in our bodies that cause us, our bodies to be unhealthy, cause us to suffer with depression and anxiety. And this is such powerful information. The good news is that now that we have this information, we have to start talking about prevention, because ACEs is preventable. Adverse childhood experiences are preventable. So we really need to start focusing on how to prevent a child's exposure to toxic stress if we want to enhance their health and well-being for their lifetime.
Sure, and I'm glad that we can have you on the program tonight to begin to just talk about the subject and help people understand what it is, what it's about, because I didn't know that there was a name for it. Though I understood these kind of things happened, I never realized there was not only a name but a study, and that it's preventable, and that it carries with you later in life, unless you are able to get some help. I'm going to ask you too, what are the biggest challenges in reaching out to children who are going through this, and how do you do that?
Well, I don't know if, without parents' permission, that you can reach out to the children directly. Sure. When you're talking to, therapists or school counselors. I know that the ACE research has inspired some wonderful adoptions in schools. There are some schools that have actually, there's a movie called Paper Tigers, and it was done by Robert Redford's son, and forgive me, I'm forgetting his name, James Redford. And they actually went to schools that were considered troubled schools. So these are schools where the dropout rate is, the success rate of graduating was 60%. So these are troubled schools. They looked at a school, I think it was in Washington, the state of Washington, and in particular. And so there was, high drug use, high gang participation, a lot of single-parent families, and foster care children. So the school was a mess. And they decided to take this research and take their staff and take their faculty and take the parents that volunteer and train everybody on trauma. And they gave everyone an education and the skills necessary to work with children that have had exposure to, some of the worst, most horrible things. And instead of looking at a risky behavior in school and saying, what's wrong with you, and punish them and give them detention, actually now administration was saying, hey, what happened to you? Are you okay? And you'd be surprised at how many young people would want to open up about what's going on, but never have been asked the right question before. Sure. It's just a simple, kind question instead of accusing them of something. And when a child is acting out, they're usually acting out for a real valid reason, and they need help. So this school, when they got the training and they started working with children from a trauma-informed, trauma-responsive perspective, the success rate for graduation rose to, I think it was 95%.
Wow.
In a couple of years.
Wow.
So we know that understanding what ACEs are, understanding how to support a child that's experiencing this type of trauma, how to support the family as a whole. So now, in I remember one particular instance where a child was sleeping somewhere outside the school, and that child would have gotten a suspension for being on school property. And I think the student was on the roof of the school. Becoming trauma-informed, they were able to ask the right questions and provide the right resources and find out that this kid is homeless. Wow. Now, this child had gone in and out of foster care, and, from one foster home to the next, their experience was more trauma. So it was safer for this child to live out on the streets, if you will, at the school to keep themselves safe. And they were able to provide the proper resources to get this child a safe home, to support the family who needed the support, the family who needed resources on how to heal with their own trauma. Because that's initially the problem, Leslie, is when we have a family that was raised with trauma and now they have children.
Sure.
And now we're raising those children from our trauma.
Right.
And then we're giving them more trauma to place upon their shoulders. So the best approach always in supporting the children is to support the family. And whether that's, a lot of these children had a parent that was incarcerated. And, the toll that took on them and their bodies, and not really having anybody to talk about it in a constructive way or a helpful way. We also have the problem with, our child protective services in this country, our foster care nation, where if a child needs to be placed, they're not placed with their family. So, it could be an aunt, an uncle, it could be, a grandmother, a grandfather who desperately wants to step in because their child, it may be, on drugs or alcohol and not able to care for the child, and they want to take that child. But Child Protective Services comes in, does not give the child to the grandparents or the aunt or uncle, and places them in foster care. So if their primary caregiving parent in that scenario is a grandmother or aunt and uncle, they lost that person too.
Sure.
So their trauma is not being addressed, as well as now they've been re-injured. And we know for sure from the ACE research, if a child is separated from their primary caregiving parent, it's most often a mother, sometimes it's a father, sometimes it's a grandparent, and those things are not considered. And these children are re-victimized and re-traumatized. And we see this all the time in family court as well. That experience that I was talking to you about, how it kind of changed my life trajectory of where I was going to go. I was going to school for child psychology at one point in my life, which I loved, but I wound up becoming an activist because helping one person at a time was not enough to the amount of children that were being traumatized by these systems in place that are failing to recognize trauma, that are failing to recognize all this research, which would not only help these individual children and these individual families, but it also helps our economy. Because when these children are in crisis and their families are in crisis, and these moms who are trying to protect their children from domestic violence or sexual abuse are being bankrupted, the economic strain that it causes our country, I don't remember the exact number, and forgive me right now, but I'm thinking it was somewhere around $128 billion.
Wow.
That it costs our country every year from childhood trauma because of the lifetime impact that it has on being able to get a job, being able to keep a job, health care, depression, mental illness, and medications for, all these symptoms. And now, like I mentioned to you earlier, my kidney shut down. This is, ironically, my stepbrother, so I'm one of five, I'm the youngest of five. My stepbrother just had a kidney replacement. And we have, in my family, alcoholism. My brother passed away from alcoholism, severely depressed. We all grew up in a very traumatic home, a lot of violence in our home. We lived in fear every day. And so with the fight or flight mechanism, mine was usually fight, which is a good thing, and it could be a bad thing sometimes.
Sure.
As an adult. But that was what we needed to do to survive. But all of us experience some extreme health problems due to that toxic, prolonged stress that we had from our home, from our family home.
Sure.
When we were kids.
And like I said earlier, I don't think people realize that, and because it's not talked about, because they're, our systems that we have in place are not recognizing what this does to children and how better to help them, that cycle just continues. So I heard you mention earlier about family court and child protective services.
Yes.
And the crisis of children coming in there on a daily basis. Why are our court systems not being informed and aware about adverse childhood experiences?
Great question. So this is a multifaceted problem, and as I mentioned earlier, this has a lot to do with women not having our equal rights. I'll say it again and again and again. Until women have equal rights under our Constitution of the United States, we will always be treated with second-class status in any court of law. And that is ever visible and apparent in family court. And Child Protective Services is an extension of our government. Our welfare agencies are an extension of our government. So they're all operating under the same mechanism. So, it makes me frustrated when we have the United Nations talking about 1 in 3 women. 1 in 3 women in the world will experience domestic violence or be raped in her lifetime. 1 in 3 women will be beaten or raped in her lifetime. But yet she goes to family court and brings up allegations of domestic violence or sexual abuse of her child, and she's automatically disbelieved.
Yep.
Against all the research, against all the experts, automatically disbelieved. Now, there's a few reasons why this is happening that we believe. We believe that there's fatherhood funding that has become a problem, a huge problem for women in this country. It started off with good intentions. It was started back, I believe, in the 90s when fathers were having children and then taking off and not paying for them. And then that mother and child became a problem for the rest of America, who has to pay for these welfare programs to provide for this mother and child when there's a father out there. And so they started finding those fathers by their Social Security number and docking their pay no matter where they went. They can go to any state in the country and they'd be found, and they'd have to pay child support for that child. There was a shift in the 90s. There was a shift in the 90s when that started happening, and people started saying, wait a minute, she gets the kids and I have to pay. Let me fight for custody so I don't have to pay. Now you have some batterers, child molesters, some of the worst people on the planet fighting in family court to take the children away from the mother, or 50-50 custody so they don't have to pay child support. All of this flies in the face of research, science. We know that a child exposed to this toxic stress, so if you have a man, let's say that batters the mother, but now they're separated, and then family court says to her, she's trying to protect her child, and they're saying, you're not being the friendly parent. We want to see friendly parents in our courtroom, even though she's acting out because she's saying, oh my gosh, my child is being exposed, and I'm not there now to protect my child. And so she appears, like the irrational one, but if that judge or the courts were actually held accountable for not being trauma-informed, for making these decisions based off of money, because fathers, when they get custody, there's a financial kickback for these programs. There's no motherhood.gov, by the way. There's a fatherhood.gov, but there's no motherhood.gov. And our children are essentially being stolen from us through family courts and this process. There are so many books. There are so many books out there now written by mothers who have been tortured, absolutely tortured in this way. And you're getting more and more information about how this is being done, but nobody's doing anything about it because family court is a closed courtroom for the most part. Leslie, you and I could go to sit in a courtroom and we could be kicked out, even though it's a public courtroom. They're going to say it's a family courtroom, and the judge has the discretion if we're allowed to be in there or not. But let's say, for instance, let me give you an example that maybe will help your listeners understand this a little better. If I was coming out of a supermarket and I get beat up in the parking lot, someone's going to call the police. The police are going to arrest the person who harmed me. The state prosecutor is going to take on the case. I will not have to hire my own attorney. I will be a supporting witness for the state. It'll be in criminal court. There'll be a judge, a jury, an open courtroom. My family, advocates, friends, the press can be in the courtroom. I have the best chance of justice. It's not perfect, but I have the best chance of justice in that environment. If I go outside the supermarket and I get beat up by my husband or partner, the police are called, same scenario. They ask, we're a couple? Oh, yeah. This goes to family court. It never makes it to criminal court. Immediately, we lose our rights to justice. Now we go to family court, where, unfortunately, in many of these situations, the abusive party, the man, will have an economic advantage to her. So he's going to hire an attorney. She may not have the access to hire an attorney. So she's forced to go into family court, closed courtroom, no jury, no friends, family, media, and she has to defend for herself, oftentimes pro se, meaning she represents herself because either she had money for an attorney and it ran out, or she just doesn't have it and has to represent herself against her batterer and oftentimes her abusive batterer's attorney. So it's a hostile environment that a victim who we know has experienced trauma is now forced to go into a court of law in that way to defend herself and her children. She's at a disadvantage, and oftentimes she loses custody of her children. So this is something that needs to be spoken about often because the public cannot protest what it doesn't know.
Sure.
The public can't protest this. They don't know. So how are they supposed to do something about it? So that's why I really appreciate the opportunity to come on your show and discuss it, because it is so incredibly important, the impact that this is having on our nation's children. We're causing children to be sick for a lifetime. Our systems that are in place that are supposed to uphold justice are actually causing America's children to be sick.
And so how can we change this? What can we do as ordinary citizens?
I think that's a great question, and I think that the more we educate ourselves on the ACE research and how it needs to be implemented on, the state level, so, government and our schools, I think things will improve exponentially. But that's going to take some time because, it depends on where you're from. So you're in Virginia, I'm in New Jersey. So in New Jersey, I'm able to tackle local issues. Like, I'll give you so this is how I was able to implement the ACE research. I run a domestic violence support group for survivors of domestic abuse. There was a large number of members for 10 years now. There was a large number of women who were coming forward who were in family court, who, the courts were forcing their children, when they made allegations of child sexual abuse by the father, they were being court ordered to turn over that child to the father because they were saying it was a he said, she said. The mother's making up false allegations. She's trying to get a leg up in custody. We're going to take that child away from the mother. The mother's the danger. The mother's the danger. So now we have this situation where a lot of the members were their exes or their soon-to-be exes were working with children. So now I'm hearing this rise of child sexual abuse, and their partners and spouses were teachers, coaches, worked for religious youth organizations, and they had complete access to other people's children. So even in these cases where the child sexual abuse of their own child by Child Protective Services was substantiated against the father. So the father, they go through their review and, miraculously it's substantiated and the child doesn't have to have any more access to her rapist or his rapist. Okay, so you would think that that's good, but it's not on his record, Leslie. It wasn't on his record because it didn't go to criminal court. So when he applies for jobs, working as a school teacher, a grade school teacher, working, for a camp, working for a religious youth camp, he can still get the job because it was a family incest case that didn't go to criminal court. Thank you, family court. So what we were able to do with that, because, I was losing my mind over it, like what could we do? I have a wonderful colleague, his name is Rich Pompilio. He founded the Crime Victims Law Center in New Jersey, and we worked together and we put together legislation that would require all employees that work with children, even if it's a bus driver, school teacher, coach, all of them have to also undergo a CARI check. It's CARI, which is Child Protective Services. They have to go in their records and they have to discover if they've ever been founded, if they've ever been child sexual abuse or domestic violence was substantiated against them. And if it was, they can't work with kids anymore. So we were able to use the ACE research for our legislators. We were able to use that and say, we have all this research, child's continued exposure to, the parent that has been sexually or physically abusing them, mentally abusing them, economically, financial, all of that. Now we have the research that shows what it does to the child's body, and we need to do something about it. And with that research, it opened doors. I can tell you for sure, Leslie, when we talk about women's issues, people, they go blank. It really frustrates the heck out of me.
Sure.
But they go blank. But when you talk about the science of the Adverse Childhood Experience Study and protecting a child, they open the door and let us in. And so my recommendation would be to go online, learn all you can about the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, take the ACE test yourself. You can go on to like the CDC website for adverse childhood experiences. There's even a website that's awesome called ACES to High, and it's ACESTOOHIGH.com. They have amazing articles, continued articles and information about ACE research and how it's being implemented in, I know juvenile courts, it's been implemented, schools. We really need to get it implemented in family court and child protective services, mandated. Each state makes their own decisions locally. So this is a state issue, but it's also a federal issue as well. There's much that we can do as long as we educate ourselves and we approach this in a way that will allow them to let us in. Being angry about it as an advocate and activist, which I can be, being very vocal about it, sure, and scaring people sometimes, which I can do. But when we come from the approach of protecting children's lives, how toxic stress will impact them for their lifetime, how it can shorten their lifespan by as much as 20 years, then they let us in, and we can begin the dialogue, and we can begin to write legislation like the one that we were able to do here in New Jersey, of a backdoor. It was a loophole. We closed that loophole. We have so much more to go, but we are on our way.
Great. Thank you for sharing all of that information. Thanks for being on the show. I'm sorry to say that we only are an hour long, but perhaps I can have you back on again. I think I mentioned to you in our emails that I'd like to have you back on the show and to share more information, not only about ACE, but about the domestic violence. We have had shows about that. Now that we know each other, we have also had shows about the Equal Rights Amendment and how important it is. We are pushing for that in Virginia to be the last state to ratify so that it can go to Congress. But I just wanted to say thank you for being on the program, for all the work that you do, for sharing with our listeners and viewers about this topic, and appreciate your own experience, what you went through, and how you came to be able to help others.
My absolute pleasure, and thank you so much for what you do. I love your show.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Have a great night.
You too. So I hope everyone that tuned in tonight learned a little bit more about what ACE is. I hope you will go to the CDC's website. Again, that's going to be www.cdc.gov, violence prevention /ACEs study, where you can take the test and find out what your score is. But not only that, try to, if your score is high, that means you're affected. That means it's affecting your choices, your health, everything about your life. And you want to fix that. You want to do something about it. You want to make it better. And if you are in a position to help someone else that you think might be affected by this, please refer them. Please try to help them. Please help other people learn about it, educate. That's how we're going to change things. That's how we're going to make a difference. We can each do our part. Again, I want to mention, as I did at the beginning of the show, that this very topic is sort of happening right now in the nomination of our Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who has been accused of sexually assaulting someone in their youth, which is what this subject is about. That person, from the get-go, from what we've heard from our congressman, is that, sure, they might believe her, but that doesn't change how they feel about the nominee. If you don't agree with that, if you feel like you want to do something about that, you can look up your senator. I can tell you in Virginia that both Mark Warner and Tim Kaine have come out against that nomination. But there's many senators who have not. So if you feel strongly about that, if you want to do something about that, I can tell you to give a call to two senators who seem to be undecided at this point, and who are women, who should totally be able to understand.
Which I cannot understand. I just can't.
Me either.
I don't get it.
So they are Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. Again, they're both undecided. If you have ever been a victim of harassment, sexual assault, childhood trauma, you're going to want to give them a call. Let's bombard them. Here's their phone numbers. You can reach Lisa at 202-224-6665. And Susan Collins, you can reach at 202-224-2523. I want to thank you again for tuning in tonight to WRWK, for listening to our program, HER, Human Equal Rights, with the focus on HER. And I invite you to tune in every other Wednesday to the program. Well, we will share information with regards to human equal rights with a focus on HER. So thank you to Sarah, producer of the show, who's off camera but does all the background work.
I try to keep it running.
And I invite you to tune in again. Thank you. Thanks for listening. Again, we do accept donations. You can go to our website, wrthewrkfm.org, or you can go to our Facebook page where there is a blue donate button. We need all the help we can get.
Yes.
Our station is totally supported through your donations, some grants here and there, and we are an all-volunteer station. So thanks again for listening. Appreciate it. Join us again for our next edition of HER 2 weeks from today.
Yes, and that will be October when we next see you, October 3rd, I believe, that Wednesday night. So thank you for tuning in. This is WRWK 93.9, The Work FM, licensed to Midlothian and serving the greater Richmond area and beyond through the power of the internet. Woo! We want to thank you again for tuning in, and we now return you, after a little bit of Bob, to our regularly scheduled programming. Get this plugged in, if that will work. Is that working? There we go. There's Bob in the background. And thank you so much. And everybody have a safe night.
Home and going to the clinic where they work and distributing them there. They actually